Hello, my name's Guy Armstrong. I'm the author and publisher of this book, How Essential is Fluoride? I live in New Zealand and I write as a New Zealand citizen, yet this book has a lot of relevance to people around the world as I look at a lot of the American experts in fluoridation research, a lot of research from around the world, but of course a ton of it came from America. I look quite heavily at New Zealand, Australian and American newspapers over the last 70 years, as well as New Zealand archives in which experts here contacted various experts around the world. This book focuses on what I consider to be an exaggerated claim made by many proponents or advocates of the fluoridation of public water supplies. I demonstrate that proponents of fluoridation are exaggerating when they state that fluorine is an essential element on a par with calcium, iodine and phosphorus, for example. One thing I noticed about fluoridation is that discussions in media and even scientific literature often degenerate into abuse, and that abuse has a myriad of consequences, and I would say abuse even has functions, some of which appear to be a little deeper than just letting off a little steam. So this presentation is about abuse, and I should say that both sides of the discussion around fluoridation of water supplies, commonly abbreviated to CWF, have been abusive in different ways over the years. Most of this book focuses on statements and claims made by supporters of CWF, but the section on abuse also incorporates abuse from the opponents. However, in this presentation I'm pretty much only looking at stuff from the supporters or the advocates of fluoridation, but of course, like I say, the book has a bit of both sides as far as abuse is concerned. The first 4 chapters of this book are about the science. The 5th and 6th chapters zoom out to a bigger picture of politics, economics, sociology, what kind of future we want to create for Keith Richards and our children, and then return to science in the end. It's ironic that some of us who want to increase public health often want to do it with hurtful, intimidating words. Appraising the effects of abuse is very difficult, as these effects differ person to person, culture to culture. Yet I believe abuse has had an inhibiting effect on debate, discussion and information. Some people are thick-skinned, some are thin-skinned, some people care more than others about their careers, promotions and prestige. Some people are very proud, some are willing to concede points if they don't know, some always want to get the last word in, some are stubborn, some are polite. It's arguable that the media do not help by printing abusive comments. This is an easy argument to make, as I don't enjoy reading insults unless they're quite creative. Yet I think making the media inoffensive would probably do more harm than good. Painting our anger or offence rosy-coloured would be very misleading, making it even harder to see how our personalities shape what we call our objective opinion. I don't share the comments and examples in this chapter to start a fight. I share them so we can be honest about our biases, our lack of self-control. 5 minutes on a social media fluoride page will probably yield a lot more insults than what you'll read in my book, but what I include here relates to print media, continues in an historical vein, and may help to partially explain attitudes and behaviour of not only each side but also of journalists, counsellors and newspaper editors. We may ask, is abuse justified? So in the previous chapter to this one, I quote historian Howard Zinn, who said in one interview when he was talking about his experience in World War II, I'm quoting, "You decide at the outset they're wrong and you're right, and once you've made that decision, you don't have to think anymore. Once the decision was made that we were the good guys, we could do anything we wanted." So a belief in one's virtue gives one a self-appointed freedom to belittle one's detractors or dissuade the public from paying attention to them. Well, in the book I begin this chapter on abuse with a quote from Johnny Mueller, a political scientist from the University of Rochester in New York. Mueller looked at strategies used by supporters and opponents of CWF in 7 California cities in the 50s and 60s. With regard to the overall strategies and arguments for the supporters of CWF, Mueller pointed to abuse as something quite normal. Quoting, "Finally, attacks are usually made on the antis, their small number and lack of prestige are pointed out, their competence is depreciated, and their motives are questioned." Mueller also looked at the ways in which the experts who presumably experts who support fluoridation should deal with opponents of fluoridation's claim that it was harmful. So he wrote, "Probably the best tactic for the pros, if the arguments can't be successfully ignored, is direct, harsh and sarcastic personal attack on the authorities and the people quoting them. The pros point to the absurdity of some of the more extreme arguments sometimes made by anti-fluoridationists, even if they have not been made in the campaign, and seek to imply that all the arguments are of the sort. This tactic can backfire, however, and takes considerable political finesse." Now this is one reason why people who oppose fluoridation may appear agitated even if they say sensible scientific things. Experts and supporters of CWF are still quite happy to act as though opponents are making extreme arguments. Mueller makes no judgment on whether these things are good, bad, right, wrong, and so on. I should add here that he writes as a supporter, sort of a passive supporter, like he's kind of pretending, or he's being as objective as he can, but he basically he believes it's safe and effective and so on. Abuse lets people know where boundaries of acceptable opinion, statement, and behaviour lie. It's quite obvious why people are abusive. Not only does it help to get a point across and allow us to let off steam, it works. I'll quote Mueller again, the same article here. When there is an adequate opposition, however, the pros can only win only if they are able to overwhelm it. This was the case in Palo Alto, where the pros spent 4 to 6 times as much money as did the antis and organised through the PTA and the Junior Chamber of Commerce what was probably the largest political volunteer group in Palo Alto history. The antis, for their part, campaigned actively and got out a mailing to all voters, but they were unable because of deficiencies in money and a number of workers to buy many ads or to do any door-to-door campaigning. The campaign was especially noteworthy for the continual sarcastic attacks made by the pros at the antis and at their authority. This was intended to discredit anything the antis said by discrediting the antis themselves, a technique which appears to be considerably more successful than point-by-point refutation of the anti-arguments. In addition, fear of ridicule helped keep respectable members of the community from joining anti-forces. Even with the massive pro-campaign and limited anti-response, the pros were able to get only 55.5% of the vote. It should be clear from this analysis that anti-attempts in state legislatures to require a 2/3 vote in local referendums would, if successful, virtually eliminate the possibility of the measure being voted in. So something for us to think about here in New Zealand or wherever else in the world you are. 2/3 of the vote. One example of abuse is from Wellington's Dominion Sunday Times in 1990. The title of the article is "Fluoride Gets a Kick in the Teeth." It's an article about John Colquhoun, or focusing on him, although there's a fair bit in it on a few other things. So we read the newspaper and presumably we're incensed that fluoride gets a kick in the teeth, and then we remember that it's April Fool's Day. And in reading the article we can see it's the people who oppose CWF that can be kicked in the teeth. Well, some of the statements in the article: the position of the pro-fluoride groups seemed unassailable, the antis dismissed as loonies. Once every reporter's joke, the anti-fluoride campaign looks set to demand fresh attention. Well, I have never found a single comment on this last statement. Not in academic literature, media, or anywhere have I seen it mentioned that if a group were every reporter's joke, that this may have detrimentally influenced media coverage of issues or information, a particularly important point when we consider that fluoridation is often settled by referendum. Well, I'll quote good old John Mueller again. Newspapers performed several important functions. Endorsement of fluoridation is virtually an essential ingredient, though certainly not a sufficient one, for pro-success in a controversial campaign, since a non-committal attitude implies doubt as to the value of the measure. And he points out, of course, the letters column is particularly useful to the opponents because it's free. They often have lower budgets and it can be exploited by a small amount of energetic people. The 1990 New Zealand article contained more. Papakura dentist John Bell laments what he sees as a blow to primary health care. He likened fluorophobes to child molesters. Dr. Bell explained, "I know that sounds emotive, but I say it because they are assaulting people with diseases and illness. The punter out there is going to have to get angry and do something about it because they are the ones who are going to suffer." Again, I've never found a single comment regarding the likening of these people to child molesters. It was possibly discussed in the letters to editors that followed this article. I did have a look, but I couldn't find any. I looked in the National Library of Wellington archive on the microfilm or the microfiche or whatever. Couldn't find any, but there's obviously the possibility that I missed it. So I should add this clipping here is from an archive at the Fairfax building that only contained articles and not letters to editors. But I think in terms of expert objectivity, which is presupposed, it's quite incredible that it's not discussed in this article. It's just said and then you keep reading the article. Bear in mind here, so I'll point to his statement, they're assaulting people with diseases and illness. Bear in mind here, this is just a year after the American National Academy of Sciences said in 1989 that the status of fluorine as an essential nutrient has been debated. They then discussed the rodent experiments that tested for fluorine's essentiality. I'm reading this thing, this is 1 year before the newspaper article here. Now, I'm not aware of anyone on the Food and Nutrition Board staff or the Commission of Life Sciences that opposed fluoridation, so this is the advocates of CWF that are looking at and presenting rodent experiments for us to answer this question. Of course, you should check for yourself. These are all rodent experiments. I'll point out the presence of Walter Mertz of the US Department of Agriculture and a well-known fluoridation supporter who may have been influential in the conclusion. These contradictory results do not justify a classification of fluorine as an essential element according to accepted standards. And if you've read Paul Connett and James Beck and Spedding Micklem's book, then you may remember reading this. Of course, the National Academies here point out that it's valuable. Here you can see a dividing line between necessity and benefit. So here it's non-essential but beneficial under certain circumstances, obviously. Well, Dr. Bell's comment a slide previous shows us one of the presuppositions that many or possibly most experts have in their thinking, that we're harmed by an absence of fluoride. And if you read my work, you'll see not only that the evidence to support this claim is very weak, but that even advocates of fluoridation state in their technical literature that fluoride is very abundant. I have a whole chapter on this, chapter 4. Well, these examples of abuse demonstrate what the conclusion of non-essentiality is really up against, and I should add there's a lot more examples of abuse in my book. So if you like a bit of rough and tumble, well, hey. Well, when we take a microscope to the matter, close to 100% of the experts who've mentioned the subject agree in print media, newspapers and so on, that fluorine is a nutritional essential. Of course, what I'm demonstrating in the book is that this is not accurate according to the scientific stuff. So that 1989 document I just showed said it's not a nutritional essential. But if you look at the newspaper clippings in the 1990s, all the experts still just go on saying it is a nutritional essential, just regardless, without even mentioning that 1989 document. Anyway, while the media allows people with differing views free expression, gives them a fair half and sometimes more of the opinion column to express this, abuse has a curbing effect on their credibility and possibly a silencing effect on other members of the public and journalists. As I point out in the book, this claim has been made repeatedly over the last 7 decades, and in the instances that the National Academy of Science have claimed otherwise, claiming fluorine's non-essential, that's just ignored by the advocates of CWF and the mainstream media. Journalists don't point out the contradictions, neither do other advocates of CWF, and that's a big reason why the exaggeration of essentiality continues. Well, some people who disagreed were obviously us who oppose fluoridation, but you can see most of us aren't taken seriously by advocates regardless of what we say. In 2013, a tribunal was held in New Zealand's city of Hamilton to decide if the city should stop or continue CWF. This was an event in which people on both sides of the fluoridation debate could share their attitudes, beliefs and research, and you can see here on the slide there is names and so on of various media articles. Personally, I think both sides that presented at the Hamilton Tribunal made much weaker arguments than they could have, and I think they did so because of a sort of fragmentary approach of having individuals present claims and research instead of getting together, for instance, like workers in a union, like having one person who knew heaps about the immune system do that, and one person who knew heaps about some other aspect do that aspect, and so on. I think that would have been a much stronger way. The tribunal in Hamilton lasted 4 days. For readers who believe there's not enough time to make a decision or mild investigation on a subject, I'll offer some polite, sort of tepid agreement, depending on the subject, of course. In the introduction of the book, I mentioned Charles Darwin's study of barnacles, yet that had more to do with mastery of a subject. An article in a Waikato newspaper by DHB, a District Health Board member, Denise Irvine, voiced a similar criticism upon hearing Mayor Hardika claim that she'd learnt a lot over the last few days. The certainly learnt a lot over the last few days line is actually a bit worrying. It could imply that the Mayor thinks that a few days is all it takes to come up to speed on fluoride. My apologies if I've incorrectly interpreted this. Well, this quote, learnt a lot over the last few days, was apparently on Mayor Hardika's Twitter account. I've never been on Twitter, so had a wee look. But assuming Irvine's article is accurate, and it's probably accurate, it would have been between the 5th and 15th of June 2013. So have we got any Twitter historians in the audience? So Denise Irvine's criticising the Mayor Julie Hardika, for saying, hey, I've learnt a lot over the last few days, and she thinks, of course, Denise Irvine thinks you need a bit longer than that to get up to speed or get up to date on the fluoride research, a big serious topic. Well, one wonders how much time is acceptable. Now, Dr. Rob Beaglehole of the New Zealand Dental Association did not spend all that much more time than the Hamilton City Council in his appraisal or research. According to the Nelson Mail, 16th of May 2015, Dr. Beaglehole said when he became the Dental Association spokesperson, he spent a week looking at all the evidence on fluoridation to make sure he thoroughly understood the topic and knew all the evidence was correct. Well, a week is 5 days. The Hamilton Tribunal was 4 days. Now, I certainly don't want to cast aspersions toward Dr. Beaglehole and the NZDA, but we might propose the question of which documents Dr. Beaglehole looked through when he did his making sure. Consider this with regard to the average citizen voting in a referendum. How much time does the average citizen spend? Nobody seems to discuss such a thing when citizens vote the way of the experts. At least nobody who supports fluoridation, who's supposedly objective. I will also point out in 2017 I spent 6 months in the Health Department archives, and I still have questions in areas of uncertainty where there is simply no information at all, or where some does exist but it's difficult to get hold of. So when we discuss all the evidence, we ought to consider how big our sample size is, and I'll add in here, we also ought to discuss things that have never really been discussed before, which of course is difficult. To give you another example close to home, John Colquhoun's PhD thesis contains research like letters and so on from these archives here in Wellington, as well as archives of the Dental Association in Auckland. So to verify his claims, we'd need to visit both places. There's a crucial difference here that I point to in a few parts of the book. When the advocates talk about all the evidence, they often just mean the scientific stuff that got through peer review and got published in the prestigious journals. Now, when the people opposing fluoridation talk about all the evidence, they often mean political stuff, things in various archives that are maybe more relevant to history than to science. For instance, things that John Colquhoun included in his PhD. Now, a guy like me, I'm not the greatest science kind of dude around, so for me, if I read political stuff and historical stuff, that gets me a bit, I know it wets my whistle a bit more, because some of the scientific stuff is, incredibly complicated and time-consuming to read, and I'm not a professional scientist, even though I have a degree in biology. Well, I'll point again to political scientist John Mueller's statement that fear of ridicule helped keep respectable members of the community from joining anti-forces. Fear of ridicule probably prevents many from participating. Tribal leaders don't want to lose their leadership or be ostracized. Leadership has obvious perks. Mueller's observation is noteworthy given that experts consistently claim to be scientific and objective. Experts claim it is those people opposed to fluoridation who are emotional, not the experts. Yet fear of ridicule is an emotional thing, and I think it's safe to say it has probably dissuaded many experts on top of other community members from bothering to look too deeply at CWF or say anything. Or, it's kind of hard to tell, and it's difficult to sort of form a definite opinion on. I think I think it's sensible to not have too definite an opinion on this at the moment anyway. Proud people don't like to admit that they're scared. Just like confidence in expert claims of current science, fear of ridicule is expressed by conforming to the status quo and therefore is nearly impossible to detect from outside. A timid person with a strong argument is possibly less likely to express it if they feel intimidated. Fluoridation of community water supplies began in America in 1945. An investigation of fluoridation is lacking without some knowledge of the political climate of America in that time period. One of the appendices of my work looks at the impact Joe McCarthy had on American thought and media. I suggest that he may have been the inspiration for the claim that fluoridation was a communist plot. I've seen the claim made many times back in the 1950s, looking at old archives, but I never saw any evidence provided by the people who made it. This was a claim made by many who opposed fluoridation. I should say not all, certainly not the more evidence-based or scientifically interested opponents. The intellectual climate that Senator McCarthy intensified was one of hysteria and probably clouded many, many issues. Both experts and activists from New Zealand were heavily influenced by Americans. This is evidenced by personal letters to editors, and articles which are available in the New Zealand media and health department archives. The fluoridation debate was like our own mini-America in this part of the world. This American influence probably altered how New Zealanders would have approached fluoridation if left to their own devices, but this is difficult to tell. Abuse from people for and against fluoridation in some instances intimidated and threatened counsellors, I think even when it was not intended to. That both sides of the debate were abusive helped to cause standstills, and in my opinion, though this is hard to tell with precision, make journalists and legislators less likely to speak and write honestly in public on the issue, though some took a brave stand on either side or for the right to change their mind. The 1990 article mentioned earlier claimed, for years journalists have dodged fluoride issues, partly because they thought it was boring and partly because of the loony mail that was always bound to follow any article. Well, can't blame them too much. Practical New Zealand journalists possibly sniffed the polarising likeness to McCarthyism and found themselves under some sort of emotional coercion, regardless of who they interviewed. This is my opinion based on the research in this book and the archives used to obtain many of the media articles. Looking at the issue with hindsight, we can see so much of the American research and arguments just played out over here, the same old things in the same old ways, but at the time we didn't think it thoughtless. In fact, I'd say we welcomed it. I say you can't blame journalists too much, but I have sort of gone back and forth and all around wondering how much responsibility journalists have in this kind of thing. At the moment, I'd say regarding the exaggeration of essentiality, I'd say journalists take maybe 10% of the responsibility, and the scientists and experts can take the other 90% or something. I don't know, but I write this book partly with the emphasis of my target audience. As the target audience is the average New Zealander or the average American, Canadian, British person, whoever from whichever part of the world. It's relevant to pretty much anyone in the world who is interested in American power and influence, but I wanted to especially emphasize journalists and city councillors because I think they're both two really important groups of people in fluoridation, and they really should sort of know about it, or maybe I shouldn't put it quite like that, because they should know about tons of stuff and it's difficult to pick exactly what you should know about, but there are bad things that happen if journalists and city councillors don't look into it. If at least some journalists and some city councillors should follow it sort of properly or professionally, or like really intently. So anyway, I read out this claim about loony mail and thinking it was boring and stuff. Well, yeah, I've studied it for 10 years or something now, a little over 10 years, so yeah, I can kind of relate to that in a light-hearted manner. Please forgive me, it's late at night. This next one's absolutely not light-hearted, but talking about city councillors, well, here you go. I want to quote from a Wisconsin newspaper that discussed a resolution adopted by the Executive Council of the Georgia Dental Association back in 1959. Quoting the paper, the resolution urged dentists to use their influence as citizens to replace officials who continue to block fluoridation. Excuse me. This may help us to understand the unanimity of public health officials regarding fluoridation programs. You can also see the belief here of American dentists that we suffer without fluorine. Note that this is only 2 years, right? This is 1959. This is only 2 years after the publication of the Maurer and Day experiment, and the same year as the publication of the Wathier and Phillips experiment. Well, how I might be wrong there, just going off the top of my head here. Wathier and Phillips may have published in 1958. Can't quite remember. Anyway, both of these experiments claim the element should be considered non-essential. Now, if you think it's unfair to expect experts to know about experiments before they're published, just remember that in the 1970s many people knew about Klaus Schwarz's research before that was published, and he concluded fluorine essential, and people were talking about it long before it was published. I mean, not long before, but a few months. Well, compare this resolution with a recent claim made on one of the Making Sense of Fluoride web pages that no one here is stopping anyone to vote it out. No one here is stopping anyone to vote fluoridation out. One can see that the actions of the Georgia Dental Association were precisely what would stop people from voting it out. This is a less than perfect comparison because of the time gap, yet it shows one of the points I make, and let me say this as compassionately as possible. Daniel Ryan's statement here that no one is stopping anyone to vote it out is probably made with total sincerity, I assume, no disrespect here, no personal, nothing nasty. It might be true for modern New Zealand, but it demonstrates that we don't know very much about the history of CWF. This is a pretty obscure newspaper clipping. Well, I've never seen this resolution of the Georgia Dental Association discussed anywhere in any literature on fluoridation, except for a small article in the Seattle Daily Times. If you've read my book and I say I don't see this discussed anywhere, it's true. I finished the first draft of the book September 2018. I published it in June of 2020, and I started obsessively, well, I won't say obsessively, but diligently reading the Seattle Daily Times fluoridation articles maybe a few months ago. So I finally saw this Georgia Dental Association thing mentioned then. Now, one would think it would warrant discussion somewhere in the technical literature if Georgia dentists were attempting to see city officials replaced, to have city officials replaced. If anyone's seen it outside my work, feel free to let me know. So this is 1959, right, this Georgia Dental thing. 3 years later, in 1962, the Journal of the American Dental Association ran an article in the November issue authored by John Kreitzberg, director of the branch of dental health at the State of Georgia Department of Public Health. Kreitzberg claimed out of 11 referendums for fluoridation in the state of Georgia, all 11 had been won by the supporters. It's 1962. The article focused on policies of Georgia's health department. The resolution for the removal of officials opposed was not discussed. Although one health officer's life was threatened, this was mentioned in passing, no details given. Pretty tragic that it sometimes gets to this extent, assuming it's true. Well, I'll read you a bit here. Therefore, the city officials failed to appropriate the necessary funds. During the promotional phase of the program, the life of the health officer was threatened because of his strong stand favouring fluoridation. Even though this threat was upsetting to his family, he continued to take a strong stand for fluoridation publicly. This article claimed one other factor in the promotion of fluoridation in Georgia that may be significant is that no effort on the part of the branch of dental health has been made to hasten city officials to make a decision. Reliance on local community efforts is perhaps a slower method of getting fluoridation, but it appears to be more lasting and seems to be a sound approach in the state of Georgia. We feel that it is foolhardy to force a decision when the chances are that we may lose. We are convinced that pressure leads to campaigns, these to public fights, and these in turn to indefinite delay in fluoridation. Well, no effort is made to denounce publicly individuals who oppose fluoridation. Now, I won't guarantee that either of these claims are definitely true, the life threatened and the resolution from a few slides back, but it demonstrates there's a differing message. Dentists who read this journal get a totally different picture of the issue than someone who only reads the newspaper claim. And when I wrote this book, I wanted to write something that is uplifting for everyone. I don't care if you hate fluoridation, I don't care if you love it. I don't care if you're on the fence, I don't care if you don't know anything about it. I wanted to write something that was uplifting for everyone, regardless of who read it, and that's why I look at a lot of obscure stuff. There's no point in rehashing stuff that's been said a million times. But this will help to explain to dentists why some people hate fluoridation and badmouth it and give dentists a hard time when you see stuff like this, and then dentists read this kind of thing about how honourable and good guys in Georgia are, and I wouldn't want to badmouth them or anything. Don't know them personally, of course. Well, people who read both will see the contradiction, only 3 years apart, remember, and scratch their heads wondering if it's ever been mentioned or discussed anywhere. Well, let me point out one sentence near the bottom here. No effort is made to denounce publicly individuals who oppose fluoridation. This is where all the anti-fluoride people throw their heads back and laugh, of course. Well, in defence of the ADA's journal, I looked in the Atlanta Constitution around the late 1950s and early 1960s. That's the big newspaper in Atlanta, and the abuse was pretty mild. Just stuff describing the anti-fluoride people as misinformed and so on, maybe a little gullible and so on. Nothing too nasty. That's typically big cities have the more mainstream, more pro-fluoride statements and less anti-establishment reporting and opinions, so no effort is made to denounce publicly individuals who oppose fluoridation. Well, 3 years later, a little effort was made. Dr. Harold Hillenbrand of the American Dental Association was quoted in the LA Times, Los Angeles Times, claiming that opponents of fluoridation were emotional and scientific primitives. He was the American Dental Association's journal assistant, then full editor from 1942 to 45, according to the Chicago Tribune. From 1938 to 1951, he was also Associate Professor of Ethics and Social Relations at the Loyola Dental School. It's very difficult to generalize when looking at an issue that has spanned decades, but being abusive is one way in which people on both sides of CWF have undermined the more evidence-based aspects of their own side. For those of us opposing fluoridation, our abuse and suspicion has also played into the hands of people claiming we're a little unhinged. For the proponents, abuse has often made them look a little arrogant and snooty. There's one more thing I want to say about experts and their abuse. While some of the experts are derogatory and openly abusive and sneering towards the opponents of fluoridation, they're not abusive towards the junk food industry and the people who sell sugar-laden products. In Chapter 5 of my book, there's a section on American media, and there I mentioned that the food industry in America spent about $3 billion on advertising in 1978 alone. And while I don't know how much of that was spent on junk food, soft drink or confectionery specifically, we know that the experts get up in arms with the people opposed to fluoridation spending a few thousand of their own dollars on their own advertising. The experts criticize the junk food industry as a threat to dental health, but I've never seen them be openly abusive to CEOs of junk food companies or call their advertising pseudoscientific propaganda, even though it basically is. The message being that an ice cream or chocolate bar will be of some wonderful benefit to my life, or a fizzy drink will make me popular. Now, in the thousands of media articles I've read on fluoridation, I've never seen any dental expert sneering and name-calling big junk food businesses. And this is kind of a hard thing to say, because dentists do badmouth and criticize industry, the junk food industry, but they don't. They're not abusive and rude and sneering towards it. Though I have to say it's wonderful to see the New Zealand Dental Association putting political pressure on the current government to restrict advertising on sugary drinks. So drinks would be labelled with things like contains 16 teaspoons of sugar for 600ml beverages, and of course there's more to it than that. Have a look at this. There's a fair bit of reading. I totally give the NZDA a big thumbs up for this. It's really good. It's really awesome. Corporations and advertising junk food to kids is really bad. So yeah, a step towards getting rid of all that is wonderful. And here's where all us anti-fluoride people and all us dentists, and regardless of where we stand on fluoridation, we all need to sort of get together on this one and have a big, I don't know, get around and sing Kumbaya and all that sort of stuff. In the thousands of media articles I've read on fluoridation, I've never seen any dental experts sneering and name-calling big junk food businesses. Perhaps such behaviour wouldn't work against people with real power, and the anti-fluoride people are an easy target. Well, back to abuse, huh? Kill the vibe there, eh? Okay, when push comes to shove, the sugar industry has some real power. Well, I don't think the discussion around fluoridation is helped by abuse, yet experts do ridicule relatively powerless individuals and citizens, but not mega corporations. While minority groups opposed to fluoridation can protest and hire a mail drop or print flyers, in terms of their ability to advertise in mainstream media, they're extremely limited. Yet when they do save up enough money to raise their voice in the public media, it's much less welcomed than junk food salesmanship. Perhaps simply changing these things is one of our fears, or better the devil that you know, or perhaps we're just so used to it. Like, I walk through Wellington and there's, multi-story junk food billboards, advertising chocolate and Coke and so on. Perhaps we're just used to that. I suggest that there are too many revolving doors in science, industry and business nowadays for experts to abuse the junk food industry. Maybe that's a bit unfair, but yeah, I don't know. Reading this in hindsight, it would probably seem very unprofessional as well. After all, it's sometimes difficult to call the junk food industry anti-science, so just consider Coca-Cola has or had a beverage institute for health and wellness, quoting, "There's no need to stick plain water if it bores you." This Coca-Cola quote is from Sharon Beeder's 2009 book, This Little Kitty Went to Market, co-written with Richard Gosden, PhD in psychiatry, and Wendy Varney, a journalist who actually wrote a book on fluoridation in the 1980s. I definitely recommend it, really good book, I think. Beeder is an honorary professor in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, Australia. Coca-Cola's Beverage Institute for Health and Wellness emphasises the importance of drinking enough fluids so as not to become dehydrated, and argues that any drink suits this purpose, so there's no need to stick to plain water if it bores you. Beeder's quoting a 2007 document, the Wellness Beverage Guide. I'll just read a little bit more from her book, their book. The Motherhood Project Institute for American Values is called Watch Out for Children, A Mother's Statement to Advertisers. Pretty interesting document if you can get your hands on it. Is written with an acceptance of responsibility on behalf of mothers, while expressing indignation that advertisers have avoided their own share of responsibility for so long. Both of these documents have sections on manipulative tactics used by advertisers to sell junk food to children. I should say the junk food industry, of course, has massive money to spend on public relations. So, I don't know, if a dentist or, a group of dentists do start to try and kick a bit of butt, or, the odd hippie gives them a hard time, probably just get, it'd be like an ant under a steamroller or something, I don't know. That's the sort of impression I get. So what can we do that's helpful and uplifting here? Well, one thing I remember from university is this statement. Read the exam question twice. It's very easy to misunderstand things, especially if we're passionate about something, so we can address claims as they are instead of a convenient straw man. We can accept that if we're involving ourselves in a debate, we're probably going to hear things that we don't agree with, which is difficult, but hey. part of the fun. Understand that even if we tell the truth or what we think is true, not everyone is interested in that. People still have their comfort zones, and some people think CWF is a strictly scientific issue. Others feel it has a multitude of layers: political, economic, corporate, and so on. We can verify claims that we're going to make before we make them. If we've been abusive in the past, apologise and be compassionate in the future. Sorry for being so abusive, etc. Understand that people's beliefs are comforting, or at least habitual, and if we're rupturing someone's comfort zone without grace or compassion, we're probably going to elicit a reaction from this person. Well, summary. This presentation looks mostly at abuse from proponents to opponents, yet my book presents abuse going both ways. There are a couple of factors that make abuse a difficult topic to be precise about. Individual reactions to it are different, and the fact that it's supposed to be emotional means it's not. It's kind of subjective by nature. Well, how did abuse affect the last 70 years' discussions around CWF? It narrowed debate by helping to polarize pro and anti-CWF people. This helped to force out well-meaning and sincere people, not only on both sides but in journalism, politics, and maybe other professions, people who may have brought refreshing perspectives into the debate. The more outrageous statements of those opposing CWF were highlighted, while their stronger arguments were ignored and downplayed. To this day, some of the claims made by opponents of fluoridation have been only poorly investigated or not investigated at all by journalists and or scientists. In my book, How Essential Fluoride, goes into detail on a few of these. One of the most poorly investigated claims was the claim that business owners and corporations were profiting from CWF by selling fluoride compounds to municipalities. That this claim was even made was offensive to many scientists and helped further divide anti- and pro-fluoridation parties. Many took offence to this claim, yet ignored it when the small smattering of evidence available was presented. Well, it's discussed in more detail in my book. There's a subtle framing that we might consider abusive in some people's work. Framing a disagreement as I'm objective and they're not is perhaps abusive, but not obviously abusive like calling someone names. It's more like gaslighting, sort of questioning their sanity. Probably the most important or influential or powerful consequence or function of abuse is that it has allowed experts advocating CWF to be quite insulated from criticism, even when constructive. They can get away with work that is less thorough, less precise, and while they fuss rather meticulously over even tiny mistakes made by anti-fluoridationists, they ignore large mistakes made by other advocates of CWF. I should say here that abuse is not the only factor in operation when we consider lack of criticism from advocates of CWF towards other advocates of CWF over contradictory statements, exaggerations, and mistakes. Of course, it's easy to win an argument if you can ignore evidence. One example can be given here, discussed in more detail in my book. The 2007 US National Academy's publication Earth Materials and Health included fluoride as a trace element currently considered essential for human health and metabolism, and cites the work of Moynihan from 1979. Included fluorine as a trace element. Some people do say fluoride with a D is a trace element, so I'm kind of used to reading that, but here they're talking fluorine, just for the really precise people. I'll say here I don't care too much whether someone says fluorine is or is not essential. I think what is really important here is the foundation of evidence they use to support such a claim. Anyway, Moynihan listed fluorine under the heading Essential Trace Element Deficiencies awaiting confirmation in man. He explains that fluorine appears to be essential for dental health, well demonstrated by the prevention of caries in children's teeth. Though back in 1979, he says it was unclear whether it was because of an action on microbes or because of incorporation into teeth. Well, this kind of thing, using the preventive benefits of CWF as demonstration of essentiality, is what I've called benefit as a criterion for essentiality. That's benefit as a criterion for essentiality. I think I'm the first to coin that phrase. Yay. Because no deficiency state for fluorine has been demonstrated. Calcium is essential because there is such a thing as a deficiency state. Iodine is essential because there is such a thing as a deficiency state. Yet, as Moynihan told us in 1979, there was no deficiency state proven for fluorine. Well, this calling it essential even without the deficiency state is kind of normal, and I give a lot of examples of this kind of thing in my book. So not only is it okay to cite work from 1979, it's okay to cite work that did not include or conclude fluorine essential in humans and present that as evidence that fluorine is essential in humans. So we didn't quite have evidence confirming its essentiality back in the late 70s. This is quite incredible given the huge number of pre- and post-1979 claims made by experts in newspapers that fluorine was a trace element in which our teeth, soil and water were all deficient. See Appendix 1 of my book. And just as a little side point here, look here where he says the role of F in bone metabolism is disputed. Well, back in the 1960s, Dr. Frederick Steer was saying F essential based on osteoporosis studies back in the late 1960s, so relative to Moynihan, Dr. Steer was a little premature. The seasoned anti-fluoridationist won't be surprised to hear that. I talk a little in the book about osteoporosis, but not much. Hardly anyone has claimed fluorine essential in bone, though of course it gets in there. Well, it's a little complicated, but Moynihan cites the work of Schwartz from 1972, reference 20 here, as demonstrating that fluoride is essential for growth in rats. I have to point out that there were two criticisms and one observation made by two scientists from the United States Department of Agriculture, that's reference 27 there, regarding Schwartz's work. I've never seen these addressed anywhere in literature that advocates fluoridation, though of course if you've read John Yamianis's book, you know he talks about it. Well, he's not advocating fluoridation. He's, the top of the pile next to Paul Connaught, being anti-fluoride. Well, the observation was blatantly obvious to anyone following the National Academy's discussions on fluoride, simply that other scientists had created rats that were more healthy on diets using less fluoride. If you recall that 1989 document I showed, you'll remember, and I'll add that this observation was made by scientists claiming fluoridation safe and effective and beneficial, so this does not come from opponents of fluoridation. It was an observation made once in a research paper on trace elements published in a science journal and completely ignored, while Schwartz's work enjoyed a huge amount of publicity in the American media of the 1970s. Well, the fact that this observation was completely ignored by everyone advocating fluoridation demonstrates that advocates of fluoridation have become very insulated from criticism. This is partly what makes fluoridation of water supplies a very quirky issue. This document number 27 here, Nielsen and Sandstead, this is cited in some of the National Academy of Science work. The advocates love to address the arguments they believe they can win against anti-fluoridationists, yet they completely ignore contradictions that come from their own side. Abuse, of course, is not the only thing that leads to this narrowing of focus and certainty of rightness, but this is one effect of abuse. And I've got to add here, because we're dealing with a 70-year topic, a history of 70 years on this issue, and we're dealing with people from around the world publishing and writing in very different mediums, we sort of got to be compassionate when we understand that they're not always aware of each other's research. So just remember, abuse is just one little aspect here. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's one little thing. Well, Moynihan also cites the work of Underwood. Hang on, there it is. But as I point out in my book, Underwood did not include two experiments from 1976, both of which concluded fluorine non-essential. One of these featured a scientist, Dr. Leon Singer from the University of Minneapolis, that had previously claimed fluorine essential for growth in mice in 1972. Underwood and the experts speaking in the American media cited that experiment, the 1972 one, and ignored the later one. In fairness to Underwood, I'll add here, his book was published in 1977, so in 1976 he'd probably written it and finished it, and it was in the pre-publication stages, and back in the 1970s the internet was a bit slower, so we can be, my personal opinion is I'm fair towards Underwood, because everything else I've read of his work is just excellent, in my opinion. And no surprise to see Dr. Perrott mentioning this on the Making Sense of Fluoride page, and he doesn't even acknowledge the existence of the Moynihan study. Well, no big deal. I'd suggest, as kindly as possible, that this is an example of confirmation bias. He read the NRC say fluoride is essential, and from then on it didn't matter why or how strong the evidence to support the claim was. Of course, Moynihan's using the statistics, the benefits of CWF as evidence of essentiality. Well, if you want to use that, that's cool. But note on this page we've got a word deficient in graph A there, but we don't really have fluorine deficiency. Well, here's an example of one claim I think false from 2007. This is from the next chapter in my book, chapter 5.6. I might be incorrect about this, so I'll ask that you verify it. Incidentally, one of the big reasons that I love my work, that I'll say it's so strong, is that almost anyone can verify it if they've got the time and can put in the effort. Obviously, the exception here is the stuff in the Wellington National Library and the Health Department archives, but a good amount of the modern technical literature is online, and from that you can see at least the most simple aspects of what I'm getting at when I talk about exaggeration of fluorine's essentiality. Well, Professor Jason M. Armfield, of the Australian... Oh, sorry, I'll say that again. I just had my dinner like an hour and a half ago. Professor Jason M. Armfield of the Australian Research Centre for Population Oral Health at the Adelaide University School of Dentistry wrote a 13-page summary on techniques used by people opposed to fluoridation that he believes undermine public health. Well, I am doing my best, man. Armfield wrote about innuendo, unproven, often derogatory claims made to impugn the integrity, ability and attitudes of others. Citing Christopher Bryson's book, The Fluoride Deception, Armfield attributed the following quote to Bryson as an example of innuendo. Quoting, "It was an era of thalidomide and plutonium, school segregation and human experimentation, atmospheric H-bomb testing and DDT. Fluoridated water was idealized as the ultimate form of 1950s fail-safe social engineering." You can see the citation at the bottom there, number 97. No page number of Bryson's book was given in Armfield's reference, but I still looked for the quote. I looked in a physical copy of the book, searching the index pictured here on the left for segregation, DDT, thalidomide and other terms. I couldn't find the quote. The book was a first edition published in 2004. In the index you can see the word DDT is on pages 234, 235 and 265. The phrase Armfield attributed to Bryson is not on those pages. The words segregation and thalidomide are not in the index. On the right here is page 234, but it's not what Armfield quoted at all. Here's pages 235 on top and 265 below. This is Christopher Bryson's book, but what's quoted by Armfield is not there. Frustrated, I thought maybe someone online had quoted the same thing but cited a page number. This seemed probable given that Armfield and others claim people opposed to fluoride get so much of their research online. I copied and pasted the quote into Google. One website came up, dryourself.com. The only responses on the search were from Armfield's article, the dryourself.com website, and a vegan site which is just quoting Armfield. It seems nobody else had quoted it online. The quote Armfield uses is made up of the first 7 sentences of the dryourself.com website. The words actually belong to the author of the website article. It does not come from Bryson's book at all, though the article is an interview with Christopher Bryson. Armfield quotes the non-highlighted part, white background. Top right is Armfield's article, bottom left is the dryourself.com introduction to the interview. I think Armfield did what many of us could be tempted to do. Googled Christopher Bryson's book, selected the first thing found and attributed it to Bryson. At least here, Armfield did not do what professors are supposed to do, read the actual book and see for himself if there is any truth to it. What does he agree with and why, what does he disagree with and why, and what is he uncertain about? He's dismissed years of Bryson's work sifting through archives, reading documents and interviewing people based on one thing he read on the internet and then attributed to Bryson. This is not warranted. I mean, assuming I'm being accurate here. Hopefully I haven't made a mistake. That'd be pretty embarrassing. If you're interested, obtain a copy of Armfield's paper, Bryson's book, and see if you can find the quote. If I've made a mistake here, I'm open to hearing it. Note that Armfield's work is peer-reviewed, yet nobody checked to verify if what he quoted from Bryson's work was accurately quoted. Nobody went through it with a fine-tooth comb. Maybe this demonstrates or fine enough. Maybe this demonstrates that the peer reviewer had a case of confirmation bias, or maybe it demonstrates that in a paper with 100 or more citations, it's difficult to verify every single one. I would definitely agree with that. I'm up to 2 or 3 A4 pages of corrections in my book. So when I send it out to people, obviously the newer copies are all up to date. So if you buy one online, it's all up to date, no mistakes, as far as I'm aware. But a lot of that stuff is a typo, spell someone's name wrong or something, you got to correct it and so on. Well, I'm not calling Professor Armfield or Dr. Perrott abusive here in these examples, but I will say that experts can get away with this kind of thing partly because of a history of abusive behaviour, much of which is from experts who are no longer alive. But their behaviour has set the stage, and we've not really looked much at it. And yes, opponents of CWF have also had a hand in this as well. Well, I want to say one more thing here. One of the ways I'm sort of working on a paper which I think is going to be about how us anti-fluoride people often undermine our own opposition to fluoridation, and I think one of the big ways, one of the worst things we do is when we badmouth, not that I do this, or try not to, but I see people online doing it, if we badmouth dentists, I think that's just really, really bad. I've had like 3 or 4 dentists in the past, I don't know, 10 years here in Wellington when I've been for my checkups and stuff, and they've all been wonderful. So I think one of the worst things we can do is badmouth dentists, and you can see, just email the NZDA, they really give a damn. I think they strike me as people who really are concerned about kids' teeth. So when I talk about dentists not being abusive to junk food companies, I'm pointing to a sort of I don't know, maybe junk food companies are partly to blame or largely to blame for this as well, because they have so much money to spend on public relations and so on, and we have people like Marion Nessel and I think David Stuckler and people like that, and is it Simone Michel, the one that wrote Hungry for Appetite for Profit, or Hungry for Profit, or whatever that book is. These are really important people who are writing about the sort of public relations power of the junk food industry. So yeah, if you think I'm giving the dentists a hard time, I certainly don't want to rubbish them at all, because I know they're probably working their butts off, and it's probably really difficult operating on children in such a way. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you find this if you like my work, feel free to head over to my Facebook page or subscribe to this YouTube channel. Thank you very much.